Welcome back to Free Speech Nation. Todd Sharpville is a musician with a long and successful career, having released his first album, which won the Best Album honour at the British Blues Awards back in 1992. Todd and his band, The Sharpville Show, isolated together in a Norfolk country house during the first COVID lockdown and streamed live music 3 times a week to the fans across the globe. Also, during the COVID crisis, Todd recorded a duet of his song Love Knows No Bounds with pop legend Robbie Williams. Here's a clip from one of his new songs, Brothers from Another Mother, a collaboration with his friend Larry McRae.
We're brothers from another mother. When we bleed, we're the same color. Blues house, chained and tethered, howling at the moon together.
And Todd's new album is this one, Medication Time. This is out this week, and I'm delighted to say Todd joins me now. Thanks. Welcome to the show. So, do you want to tell me a bit about this new album, Medication Time? And it's quite a striking front cover. You in a padded cell.
Yep.
With your guitar, though.
With my guitar. It was. I found myself 16 years after the event writing a song about an experience 16 years ago when I had a breakdown.
Right.
On the back of a bad divorce, and it was the father's rights side of the thing that took me by surprise. And I spent almost a couple of months in a mental hospital in West Wales on the back of it, which was a defining point for me in my life, and it was something that ended up being a very positive experience, weirdly, in the long term. The way that we pick up the pieces and walk down another path when things go wrong. And I wouldn't have actually changed it for the world. But, so yeah. I then found around this song that I was writing a song describing the experience and embarked on the journey of doing a whole album that was kind of dedicated to what led me into that vulnerable position.
I mean, it's an interesting approach, isn't it, to difficulties. I mean, looking at the album front cover, there might be people who see that and see that's a bit flippant. You're in a straitjacket, it looks a bit whimsical almost, but you're dealing with very serious issues there.
Yeah. And a lot of reviewers are noting at the moment that the album's actually a lot more chirpy and upbeat than they would assume it would be.
They were expecting sort of Nick Cave, dour kind of...
Yeah, well, and there's a bit of that on there.
Yeah.
But, dark humour is I come from a military family of old, and it's sort of, dark humour is what gets you through the rough stuff.
And do you think this is a common thing among musicians, is to take those terrible experiences and just drive them into something else? I mean, is that in itself a kind of therapeutic thing to do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it should be cathartic if you're being genuine, and if it's soulful and honest, then it's genuine.
Yeah.
And the best stuff comes, is heart on sleeve, and we shouldn't be ashamed of who we are and what we've been through, and expressing it in a way where, we're doing the job of an artist of reflecting society back at itself.
Do you want to tell us how you got into this world? I mean, you come from, a virtually aristocratic background, don't you?
I do, yeah.
And that's quite an interesting... People don't expect you to go from that to blues for some reason.
Yeah, although I heard a Freddie King record when I was 12 years old, and suddenly I didn't want to be a doctor anymore. I wanted to be a musician, and I wanted to play like that. And, yeah.
And how did the family react to that? Because that was...
Shocked and horrified. my dad, had a valid chip on his shoulder of being the only member of the family that hadn't been educated. It was my grandfather, blew, over 1,000 years of history and wealth and privilege on sex, drugs and rock and roll.
Really?
Yeah, pretty much. Well, the equivalent of whatever sex, drugs and rock and roll was back in that day. Yeah. So like the vast majority of Britain's aristocracy, which is an unknown point these days, especially the way that modern culture likes to still play the game of divide, is that most of us are nouveau poor.
Right.
Most of the money was in farming. Farming died a death generations ago.
Yes.
So every penny I've ever made, I've made out of music.
And did you just start on a circuit? I mean, I'm very naive about
pretty much, yeah. Bar scene, and then in my early 20s, I put out an album in my early 20s, and found myself backing bands together and backing up black American musicians who were over in Europe.
Yes.
Who needed a decent backing band, and agencies were generally quite callous and overly spendthrifty.
Right.
And it was a cheaper way of doing it. So I worked with Ike Turner and when he got out of jail, and the Howling Wolf's old guitarist Hubert Sumlin, many of the heroes that I grew up listening to as a kid.
I mean, that must have been incredible to actually meet the people that had inspired you.
Absolutely, 100%, and it still happens. It's it still happens over the course of my life, and it's always a lovely surprise, and it kind of validates all of the aggro one goes through to to be an artist and try and survive.
We might have another clip from Todd. This is "Walk Out in the Rain." I believe we've got a clip from this.
Just walk out in the rain. Walk out with your dreams. Walk out of my life. If you don't feel right, darling, catch the next train. Darling, walk out in the rain.
During lockdown, I mean, this must have put an end to all of your performances, but you found a way around it, didn't you?
I was overwhelmed. I've been going through a treading water, slightly lazy period in the run-up to all of this. So when everyone else took it as an opportunity almost to have a break, I felt like I ought to kick into action and be diligent. And I was horrified at the premise that live ensemble music was about to vanish completely.
Yeah.
And I wanted to offer the music industry behind the scenes the ability to know that there was a band where everyone had individual experience of working with big names and multi-genres available under one roof for their needs. And there are still a host of genres of music that require the nuance of a rhythm section in one room rather than this remote recording thing that works in other capacities. So I, a bit like the Blues Brothers movie, had to put together a band and spoke to just about every musician with form in the UK. And then realised I was going to need to convince someone to move in with me for an unspecified period of time during the very beginning of the pandemic when everyone was terrified.
And these weren't necessarily people you knew well?
No, not at all. Jules Holland's bassist, Dave Swift, who I'd depped in my band a couple of times.
Yeah. And
it was sort of I knew that I was going to have to ask them and their wives and kids and dogs so I needed somewhere big enough to house the project.
So you had this country house, right?
So I negotiated a nominal rent with a mansion in Norfolk that was big enough to accommodate. And then I had to find a way of capitalising it and getting work on board. And,
yes.
So the rest of the band spent much time in jacuzzis drinking prosecco, enjoying the sunshine.
Of course.
But I could have been in a hovel anywhere. I was sleeping 2 hours a night, having to do all the work.
Were you? I mean, you were doing concerts presumably over the internet.
Yeah.
Were you also creating? Were you writing new work?
Well, yeah. That and suddenly found myself being a PR man, having to handle the PR side of it and the technical side of it because we just arrived in cars with basic backline and instruments and needed equipment. There was every aspect of just making the thing work, and we spent 6 months basically living in 2 mansions in a row.
Amazing.
Doing whatever work I could hustle at the time.
But that sounds great. I mean, so many people had these grand ambitions for the lockdown, but they ended up just watching Netflix.
Sure.
But you actually did something.
Pulled a band together, lived in a mansion, did a duet with Robbie Williams.
I mean, that's not bad. It's not bad going. And do you have plans to tour with this new album?
I do, although this year, I mean, much of the touring schedule for most promoters is last year's schedule that's been moved because of the cancellations last year because of COVID. So this is very much really sort of more doing what I'm doing here, speaking to you about it and seeing what comes on the...
Yeah. Well, I know artists have been so frustrated. I mean, I spoke to Carol Decker from To Power about, her frustration about not being able to perform. And it feels like, when you're an artist, when you're a creative, when you're a musician, that without that live performance, without that interaction, so a lot of artists feel completely empty.
There's a lot of audience members. I mean, something that compelled me through the front end of all of this is I've always remembered the people out on the road who, there's a small percentage who don't have wives and kids, who don't have much of a friend circle, and some of them are slightly on the spectrum. So the way of communing with the rest of society, live music and the spontaneity of musicians gelling together and jamming, is what does it. So the evening schedule every night is normally going to gigs of different kinds, and I knew that there would be a mental health crisis amongst them, specifically, if all of this was going to suddenly stop in the midst of panic.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the cover situation with the album, I experienced a cancellation of sorts, and this is how cancel culture is so insidious and it's so subtle. A very big-time publicist in the US. He's one of maybe the 5 who can get a total unknown on Jimmy Fallon or Kimmel. I was very excited when he took the job on because these people take only literally 1% of what they get offered. And he took vicarious offence over what you said yourself at the beginning. It looks a little bit flippant, you know.
Right.
But it was my experience.
Wouldn't that have changed his view on that? That, you know, you'd actually been through this.
Exactly. Well, that's what one would hope. But vicarious offence is a very strange commodity, and it's very unfathomable in so many senses. He said it was a joke at best, an affront at worst.
Wow, how grand! I mean, but you know, surely as a creative, you have to be able to express yourself how you.
But I asked him. I said, "What was the problem with it?" He said, "Well, you seem to have a little smirk. You seem to look like you're smirking a little bit on the cover." And I said, "Well, dark humour is kind of what got me through it." I said, "If it had been a Tom Waits record, would you have felt the same?" "Oh no. Tom Waits has been around a long time. We're all familiar with the way he."
Oh, I see. So it's because he doesn't know you well enough.
Because, yeah.
It's an odd one because, you know, in other industries, the cancellation element is more front and centre and obvious. In the comedy industry, there are people saying, that joke is unacceptable, we need to call the police about that joke. In music, maybe not so much? Or...
In most other jobs, it's a much more subtle, insidious thing. I've experienced, I mean, you know, we were talking about my posh roots. People assume that you're the stereotype that they want to berate.
Yeah.
Especially if there's a possibility there might be privilege attached. So the assumption that I'm a trust fund baby or something, and that, you know, I'm not just another grassroots musician beating it out, trying to make a living on the circuit internationally, which I've done for 33 years. That kicks in, and there are lots of gigs, tours, promoters, magazine editors, people who have decided to make me an enemy because they want to, because I represent something to them, which is, you know, classic bigotry. It's I can't control who I was born to.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really excited to listen to this. I'm glad that you brought your lovely dog, Genghis, into the studio audience. I think we just about see that on the camera. Does he go to your gigs?
He sits on stage, he'll fall asleep in front of a 412 guitar cab, 100 watts.
That is quite incredible. So just remind us where we can get hold of you or see you online, or Medication Time as well.
I'm everywhere as far as all the general socials go, but I mean, every store at the moment, it's, you know, Amazon, Deezer, Spotify, all the
usual places.
All the normal platforms.
Fantastic. Todd Sharpville, thanks very much for joining me. So we